If you're a regular listener to this program, you will know that we discuss healthcare quite a bit. We discuss pharmaceuticals quite a bit, but one area of the medical world we have not explored sufficiently, in my opinion, is that of medical devices, that technology that we actually place within our bodies and that so many people rely on to stay alive or for their continued health. Well, our next guest has looked into that field in great detail. Jeanne Lenzer is a healthcare journalist. She is a longtime contributor to the BMJ, which you may have known in the past as the British Medical Journal. She is a former physician assistant herself, so she is a medical practitioner, or was, and she is the author of a new book entitled The Danger Within Us, subtitle America's Untested, Unregulated Medical Device Industry and One Man's Battle to Survive It. So first of all, Jeanne, thank you for coming on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So let's start. I try to ask unexpected questions, but that make it more interesting for the guests. But I'll start out with one you've probably been asked many times. What was the inspiration for this book? What made you write this book?
I've been writing, excuse me, largely about drugs and tests in the medical world. When a patient contacted me and said that he'd been nearly killed by this device that he had in him. And I get contacted by lots of people, patients and doctors alike from around the world. And there was something about his story that seemed really concerning. And he said that basically every attempt he made to have the problem rectified, doors were just slammed in his face. So I asked him for his medical records. You know, I wasn't sure that I wanted to take his story. I mean, a number of times I'll look into something and find that it, isn't a story that I'm going to report, that's right for me to report. So the starting point was to see his medical records. And when he sent them to me, I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't believe my eyes.
So his story, he's the one man whose narrative you chronicled. So clearly it was a matter of a medical device. May I ask what the device was?
Sure, it was a vagus nerve stimulator. And, to back up a little bit, I didn't really know that much about medical devices at the time. And he took me down the rabbit hole, not only into the whole world of medical devices, and it appears that at least 1 in 10 people in the US has at least one implant in their body, whether it's deep brain stimulators, artificial hips, corneal lens transplants, pacemakers, defibrillators, surgical mesh. I mean, the list goes on and on. And that means that at least 32 million people in the US probably have medical implants in them. And so it was the whole world of medical implants that I had to learn about, and how the FDA does or does not oversee these devices.
So that is astonishing. That statistic is actually extremely striking. And I will say, my own exposure to medical devices came when in a past life I actually used to audit medical bills and was myself shocked, this was many years ago, at the lack of rigor that people used. I didn't get directly into the regulation aspect of it, but the fact that, for example, salespeople, medical device salespeople, sometimes actively participated in surgery.
Yes.
Things of that kind. The fact that these devices, in many cases, I could see myself were untested, or there was considerable medical controversy. There was a device for stabilizing the spine, for example, and there are very few parts of the body more essential to continued good health than the spine, I suppose, the brain and the heart. But so I certainly know there's an enormous story there. So this one man's story was a the doorway for you, in effect, to the larger story. And why do you say in the title of your book that these devices are untested and unregulated? Is it really that bad?
Essentially, it actually is, even though there's an enormous amount of paperwork and an enormous amount of what are considered regulations. Um, but most of it's empty when it comes to science. Most of it is bureaucratic paperwork and requirements. So, one of the things that we've learned over the years is that there are certain types of studies that are scientific and other types that are prone to strong bias. And unfortunately, the FDA has been lowering the bar of regulation. So, I'll give you an example. The man who contacted me, Dennis Fagan, had this vagus nerve stimulator put in him to stop seizures. He had a seizure disorder. And can I tell you the story of him a little
Please
bit?
do.
What
Yeah,
happened to him?
absolutely. Yes.
So one day he was awakened at about 2 in the morning with a pain in his throat, and he associated that pain. He knew that pain meant a seizure. So he got up and he made a vertical mark on his calendar for that day because he kept a calendar so his doctor could help regulate his medicines to control his seizures, depending on how many he was having. By the time his parents found him the next morning, there were 12 marks on
Hmm.
that date. And when they let themselves into his house, he staggered out of his bedroom, lost consciousness, and fell over. When he came to, he sat down on a dining room chair and then fell over before his parents could get to him, face first into the hard floor. Then, afraid of falling again, he wiggled over to a wall to prop himself up. And there he is with his legs splayed in front of him. His jeans are wet with urine. He looks half dead. His parents frantically dial for an ambulance. By the time the ambulance gets there, he's lost consciousness 8 more times. The paramedics, when they arrive, give him some medicine for seizures, but it doesn't stop the seizures. So they rush him to the hospital where the ER doctor bumps him on the chest, trying to bring him back to life, gives him more seizure medicine, and he still can't stop the seizures. And that's when the ER doctor noticed something truly bizarre. Fagan's heart was stopping at exactly 3-minute intervals.
Hmm.
And he was passing out not from seizures, he was passing out from lack of oxygen to the brain because he had no blood flow. So the ER doctor was totally befuddled by this, had no idea what was going on, calls a cardiologist down. The cardiologist races into the ER, sees the same thing, that his heart is stopping at exactly 3-minute intervals, flatlining completely. And that's what shocked me so much when I got his medical records because, I've worked for years in ERs and ICUs, and on occasion a patient's heart will do what we call a pause, where it just doesn't beat a few beats, it misses some beats. This wasn't a pause. This was the kind of what we call asystole, flatlining, that you
Mm-hmm.
see when patients are either dead or about to be dead. And it was amazing that his heart would restart. They called in his neurologist. His neurologist arrived, and he explained the mystery that Fagan had this vagus nerve stimulator in his body, and it was set to fire electrical impulses at exactly 3-minute intervals. So the device, instead of stopping his seizures, was stopping his heart. So they rushed to get a device to turn the VNS off, and when they finally got it off, Fagan's seizures completely stopped. And despite this, despite all 3 doctors observing that the device was triggering his asystole, despite the fact that when they turned it off, the seizures stopped, the company still tried to claim that the device was not the cause of what happened.
Well, first of all, the story itself is so terrifying. I mean, the possibility of death or brain damage or anything else, and the fact that there was no protocol for communicating the fact that he had this device and that it might be a source of difficulty. Then the fact that it was the source of the problem and that they challenged that.
They not only challenged it, they went to his doctor and asked the doctor to turn the device back on.
And,
I
and
mean, this is a device that nearly killed him, and they wanted it turned back on.
now, what was their, first of all, I assume it was not a medical person that made that request, but perhaps I'm wrong. And what would the logic be there? Just so that they don't get a bad reputation?
Well, I'm surprised they actually were willing to retry it because they probably didn't want to know the answer. But it was an executive with the company who made that request. And, they will just try to wiggle out of responsibility at any cost. And this is true of all the, I mean, there are some devices that are wonderful and life-saving and life-transforming. And it's clear that many people have benefited from devices. The problem is there's many devices that are also causing enormous harm, and trying to figure out which ones are helpful and which ones are deadly is very difficult, in part because the FDA simply is not requiring the kinds of studies that are needed to know whether they're safe or not. So one
And
of the things that happened when they go ahead.
And I was going to say, and we're also in an environment where that they're becoming less likely to regulate more rather than more. And we've, for many years, been in an environment where, in fact, it's the case that executives interfere in medical decisions. I think that's a huge part of this story, too, don't you?
Exactly, exactly. And what happened with Fagan reveals all of what you're talking about. But again, it's not just the VNS device. There's many other devices that are in
Sure.
my book that I talk about that have caused cases as bad, or as I said in the book, Fagan's case is not the worst case I've heard about. There are many horrifying cases like this. But what happened, he was obviously very troubled by what happened to him when he found out that this device had stopped his heart. And he wanted to find out if this had affected other people. And he discovered the FDA's own database called the MAUDE database. And that's where adverse events associated with medical devices all those reports are held. So he dove into the MAUDE database. And what he found was that, and this was only about 8 years after the device was on the market, that nearly 1,000 patients had died with this device in them. And there weren't that many patients that had the device, and even more worrying, the average age of patients who had been studied was 33. I mean, patients with epilepsy can be children up to older adults. So this is really very concerning, and that's part of why I decided to look into his story. So by the time I was convinced that I wanted to report on this, what I did is I called the manufacturer and I said, I'd like to know how you've proved this device is safe. And I'll have to back up. The reason I asked them that question is when they looked at whether the device was to be approved or not, when they held their meeting, there's transcripts of those meetings, and they had scientific advisors, an advisory panel. And one of the advisors noted that there was a quote, and this is an exact quote from the transcript, a high rate of deaths among the test subjects and patients who were implanted with the device. Now, this is before the device is approved, and they're considering whether to approve it. And they realized that there's a, quote, high rate of deaths. So what they did, rather than ask the company to go back and do larger studies to figure out if it was safe or not, or say, no, this is too dangerous, they said, oh, okay, we'll approve it. We approve it conditionally. And conditional approval means you put it on the market and then you have to prove it's safe. So the company was asked, they're not ordered, they were asked to do post-market studies after it was on the market to prove it was safe. So this is years later. I get involved 12 years after the device is on the market. I call up the company and say, hey, where are the studies that prove it's safe? Because I did a complete literature search and I couldn't find anything proving it was safe. So I called the company and the company said, oh, it's safe. We'll send you the studies. And they sent me 5 studies. And I read all 5 studies very carefully. And there was a big problem. And I'm sorry to laugh. I mean, I just have to laugh because I can't cry. This is so horrible. They didn't report on whether there were any deaths or not in any of the 5 studies. So I called the FDA thinking the FDA must have some data to prove it's safe. After all, they've left it on the market all this time. And the FDA says, oh, it's safe. We'll send you the studies. And they sent me the exact same 5 studies that the company had sent me. So I think, gee, did they even read these studies? And I go back to the company and say, do you have unpublished data? Because you didn't supply any death data. And they said, we never collected any death data. So I said, well, how can you claim it's safe if you didn't collect death data when this was approved conditionally because of a concern about deaths? And they said, well, we did. We collected death data from the Social Security Index. Now, that's outside of a clinical study. It was instead data that they had collected from the Social Security Index, which is not all that reliable, somewhat reliable, but not all that reliable. So I asked them on behalf of the British Medical Journal to release those data to the journal, and they refused to release the death data. So I went back to the FDA thinking, okay, this is a slam dunk. We've got them now. And the FDA said, no, it's not a problem. The device is safe. We're satisfied that it's safe. And again, this is where I felt like I was in a Kafka novel. And I said, how can you say it's safe? You don't have death data. That's what you were concerned about. That's why you gave it conditional approval. And their response to me was, we never asked the company to count deaths. We only asked them to characterize deaths.
Well, it speaks to so many things that unfortunately, at least in this conversation, we're not going to be able to get into, but including, what we call regulatory capture, the idea that the regulator becomes too close to the industry rather than to the public at large. But it sounds to me like you had more than enough material for this book, given not only a story of one man, but the story of the entire industry. So you've done a great job documenting this from everything I can see. And we certainly appreciate you coming on the program and talking about it. The author is Jeanne Lenzer. The book is The Danger Within Us, America's Untested, Unregulated Medical Device Industry and One Man's Battle to Survive It. Jeanne, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.